The first lie I told was to myself. It was a simple, corrosive thing, whispered in the crushing silence of my own home. I am happy. I repeated it that November afternoon, the words dissolving like steam in the cold air. Outside, a merciless Atlantic wind tore at the last stubborn leaves on the skeletal trees. Inside, the house was a tomb, meticulously clean and utterly devoid of life. My husband Richard was gone, a sterile word for a sterile absence, another business conference in a city I couldn't be bothered to remember the name of. I had the antique-filled mausoleum to myself, a queen reigning over an empire of dust motes and quiet regret. I had just emerged from the bath, the water so hot it left my skin an angry, blushing pink. I stood dripping on the cold, unforgiving tile of the bathroom floor, wrapped in a threadbare towel, a relic from a time when comfort wasn't a luxury, but a given. The mirror showed a stranger, a woman in her late 40s whose edges had been blurred by time and concession. Her name was Eleanor, but she didn't feel like an Eleanor. She felt like a ghost haunting the architecture of someone else's life. That's when the sound came. It wasn't a knock. It was a summons. 3 solid, resonant thuds of a fist against the heavy oak of the front door. Not the polite rap of a delivery driver or the tentative tap of a neighbor. This was something else. It was urgent, demanding, and it sent a jolt of something electric and terrifying through the stagnant air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I clutched the towel tighter, a useless shield against whatever lay on the other side of that door. Tiptoeing down the hallway, each creak of the old floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone. In the 10 years we'd lived in this desolate stretch of coastal Maine, no one ever came unannounced. Peering through the peephole, the world outside was distorted, warped into a fish-eye lens of gray sky and churning sea foam. A man stood on my porch, a silhouette against the grim afternoon light. I couldn't make out his face, only his presence, a solid, unmovable shape. My hand trembled as I turned the deadbolt. I opened the door just a crack, a sliver of inquiry, and there he was, Silas, the man from the house next door, the one shrouded in as much fog as the coastline itself. He'd moved in the year prior, a recluse who kept to himself. Whispers in the small town painted him as a widower, a man running from a tragedy too heavy to name. He was older, perhaps mid-50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from storm-weathered wood and hair the color of sea salt and ash. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. He was compelling, his stillness a stark contrast to the turbulent ocean behind him. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, found mine. They didn't try to be polite and look away from my state of undress. They held my gaze with an unnerving intensity, acknowledging the vulnerability and seeing something beyond it. "I'm sorry to intrude, Eleanor," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough like rope pulled through sand, a ridiculous emergency. It wasn't fear that coursed through me. It was something far more dangerous, a current of pure, unadulterated awareness. The cold air raised goosebumps on my bare skin, but a different kind of heat bloomed deep in my belly. "What is it?" I asked, my voice huskier than I intended. A pipe burst in the wall behind my sink. The main shutoff valve is rusted solid. It won't turn. He gestured vaguely with a hand that was calloused and strong. "I was hoping, a long shot, I know, that you might have a pipe wrench, something with some leverage." The excuse was mundane, domestic, but the energy crackling between us was anything but. The way he stood there, his wool coat damp with sea spray, his posture radiating a controlled tension, it felt like a scene from a book I shouldn't be reading. "Wait here," I commanded, a flicker of my old self returning. Leaving the door ajar, I fled to the cavernous, spider-webbed garage, the towel threatening to betray me with every hurried step. A part of me felt the sheer absurdity of the moment, a half-naked woman searching for tools for a mysterious stranger. But another part, a sleeping, starved part, felt a terrifying surge of life. When I returned with the heavy, rust-colored wrench, he hadn't moved. He was watching the spot where I had been standing, his expression unreadable. "Here," I said, extending the tool. Our fingers brushed as he took it. It wasn't a spark. It was an arc of heat, a jolt of something primal that shot up my arm and settled deep in my chest. The world seemed to pause for a single breath-stealing second. "Thank you," he murmured, his gaze lingering on mine for a beat too long. It wasn't a lecherous look, not even a flirtatious one. It was a look of pure, unvarnished recognition, as if he saw the ghost in me and wasn't afraid. "I'll bring it right back," he promised, turning to leave. "No rush," I heard myself say, the words soft and foreign. He paused on the top step and looked back at me, a flicker of something. Was it sorrow? Curiosity? In his eyes. Then he nodded once and was gone, disappearing into the mist that rolled in from the sea. I closed the door, the heavy oak thudding back into place, and leaned against it, my body trembling. I told myself it was just the cold, just a neighbor, just a wrench. But it was the second lie I told myself that day. Later, as twilight bled across the horizon, staining the angry gray clouds with shades of bruised purple and violent orange, I saw him through my kitchen window. He was in his own kitchen, the single light bulb casting long shadows. He was struggling, his shoulders tense with frustration. I didn't think, I acted. I pulled on a pair of old sweats and a thick sweater, then stepped out into the biting wind and crossed the sodden lawn that separated our two lonely houses. I knocked on his door. He opened it, looking surprised to see me. "The wrench was no match for a decade of rust," he said, a wry, tired smile touching his lips. "I'm afraid I'll have no water for the night." A strange impulse, reckless and insistent, took hold of me. "You can use my kitchen," I offered, "to fill a jug or whatever you need." His eyes searched mine, looking for a motive, a catch. "Are you sure, Eleanor?" "I wouldn't want to impose." "What are neighbors for?" I replied, the phrase sounding hollow and absurd, even to my own ears. And so he ended up in my house. Standing barefoot on my cold kitchen tiles, filling a large water jug at my sink. The sound of running water, a sound so common, suddenly felt profoundly intimate. His presence was a violation of the sacred quiet I had curated for so long, and yet it felt like the first real thing to happen in that house in years. We spoke of inconsequential things, the failing plumbing, the ferocity of the weather, the decay of these old coastal homes. He had a dry wit that made me laugh, a real throaty laugh that felt rusty from disuse. He didn't rush. He lingered, leaning against my counter as if he belonged there. And as the night deepened outside, I realized the most startling thing wasn't his presence, but the feeling it evoked in me. It was the feeling of being seen. Not as Richard's wife, not as the woman from the big house on the cliff, but as a person, separate and whole. And in the subtle, charged space between us, something dormant and dangerous began to stir. He left near 10, thanking me with that same slow, penetrating gaze. "You're a lifesaver, Eleanor," he said at the door. "Any time," I whispered back. When I locked the door behind him, I leaned against it again, but this time it wasn't from a place of shock. It was from a place of quiet, terrifying revelation. A tectonic plate had shifted deep within me, and I knew with absolute certainty that the carefully constructed world I inhabited had just been fractured beyond repair. The days that followed were a study in tension. The house felt different, charged with the memory of his presence. Its silence was no longer peaceful. It was a hungry, waiting thing. I avoided him. For 2 days, I was a coward, replaying our encounters in my mind, analyzing every word, every glance, every beat of silence. The feeling he had awakened in me was a terrifying, beautiful ache, and I didn't know what to do with it. On the 3rd day, I was in the yard, hacking at a dying hydrangea bush with a pair of shears, a futile battle against the inevitable decay of the season. I heard his voice from behind me, calm and steady as the tide. Fighting a losing battle there. I spun around. He stood at the edge of the lawn, holding the pipe wrench. He wore a faded dark blue Henley that seemed to absorb the gray light of the day. "Some of us find solace in pointless tasks," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips despite myself. The sight of him was like a deep, ragged breath after holding it for too long. "Is that another way of saying you've been hiding from me?" he asked. No games, no pretense, just the stark, unnerving truth. I felt a blush creep up my neck. Maybe a little. I needed to think. "And?" he prompted gently, taking a step closer. The air between us grew thick. "I'm still thinking." He nodded, accepting it. His patience was his most potent weapon. It disarmed me, made me want to lay down my own defenses. "I was thinking," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "that I owe you for the wrench and the water. I'd like to make you dinner." The offer hung in the air, a clear and deliberate escalation. This wasn't a neighborly gesture, it was a threshold. To accept was to choose to cross it. A war raged within me, the dutiful, careful wife versus the starved, awakening woman. "I don't know, Silas," I began, my voice trailing off. "Eleanor," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It's just dinner, I promise, no pressure, no expectations." And I believed him. Something in his profound stillness told me he was a man who meant what he said. So I said yes. That evening, I dressed with the meticulous care of a soldier preparing for battle. I chose a simple, deep crimson blouse that felt both elegant and defiant, pairing it with dark jeans, a touch of mascara, a hint of color on my lips. I was arming myself, though for what, I wasn't sure. His house smelled of old wood, cloves, and roasting garlic. It was spare and masculine, but not cold. A low, melancholic jazz instrumental played softly from an unseen speaker. The lighting was warm, casting everything in a soft, forgiving glow. "Wow," he said as he opened the door, his eyes taking me in with an appreciation that was so frank and genuine it made my breath catch. "You are breathtaking." Dinner was an exercise in quiet intimacy. We didn't talk about our pasts in detail, but we spoke of the quiet architectures of regret, the strange sensation of watching your own life from a distance. He spoke of loneliness not as a void, but as a heavy blanket. I spoke of a marriage that had become a partnership in maintaining a property, nothing more. "We're comfortable," I admitted, the word tasting like ash. "But the fire went out so long ago I think we both forgot what warmth felt like." He simply nodded, his role not to fix, but to witness. After dinner, we sat on his enclosed porch, watching the churning black sea under a sky full of cold, distant stars. He poured us each a small glass of whiskey. "I don't want to complicate your life, Eleanor," he said into the silence. "But I have to be honest. I feel something when I'm near you. A resonance I thought I'd lost for good." My heart did a slow, painful flip. "I feel it too," I whispered, the confession escaping before I could stop it. "But I don't know what it means. I don't know what I'm doing." "It doesn't have to mean anything tonight," he said, his voice a low comfort. "Let it just be." His hand moved on the small table between us, a slow, deliberate motion. His fingers brushed against mine, a silent question. I didn't pull away. I let my fingers rest against his, a fragile point of contact in a vast, complicated world. We sat that way for a long time, until the whiskey was gone and the house grew cold. When he walked me to the door, his hand rested for a moment on the small of my back, a gesture of such profound and gentle possession it made me tremble. As I crossed the dark lawn back to the hollow shell of my own house, I knew something had irrevocably begun. It was no longer a spark. It was a slow-burning fire, and it was threatening to consume the world I knew. Richard returned a week later, smelling of airport lounges and the faint, cloying scent of another woman's perfume. He was full of hollow cheer, kissing my cheek with the dry, passionless peck of a distant relative. He moved through the house like a landlord checking on his property, his presence a jarring intrusion on the new, fragile atmosphere that had settled in his absence. He was a stranger in his own home. That night, unable to bear the suffocating silence of our bedroom, I slipped out onto the back porch. The air was frigid, but I needed it. And then I saw him. Silas was on his porch, too, leaning against the railing, a lone silhouette against the darkness. Our eyes met across the 50 feet of dead grass that separated our lives. An invisible thread pulled me. I stepped off my porch, my bare feet numb against the frozen ground, and walked toward him. He didn't move, just watched me approach. "It feels like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, I confessed as I stood before him, my voice a broken whisper. "And I'm afraid to finally let it out, because I don't know what happens after." His gaze was gentle, full of a deep, aching understanding. "Then don't think about what happens after, Eleanor. Just breathe." And in that moment, under the vast, uncaring sky, I did. I took a slow, shuddering breath. He reached out, his movements always measured and slow, and took my hand. His touch wasn't a claim, it was an anchor. And then, I don't know how it happened, maybe it was the pull of the moon on the tide, or the pull of years of unspoken loneliness, but I leaned in. His lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not of urgency or demand. It was a kiss of profound and devastating tenderness. It was careful, searching, and filled with all the words we couldn't say. It tasted like whiskey and salt, and a truth so raw it hurt. It was the taste of coming home to a place I'd never been. When we parted, I rested my forehead against his, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to apologize or explain or retreat. I was just there. I went back to my house that night and slipped into bed beside the sleeping form of my husband. I didn't have a plan, I didn't know the future, but I knew I could no longer live the lie. The conversation with Richard a few days later was not a fight, it was an autopsy, quiet, clinical, and heartbreakingly final. "When was the last time you were truly happy to see me?" I asked him across the kitchen table. He looked at me, his eyes blank with surprise, and after a long, damning silence, he answered with devastating honesty. "I don't know." That was the end. Not of our marriage, but of the pretense. It took weeks of painful sorting, of legal papers and quiet goodbyes, before I found myself walking again. It was early evening, the kind of golden dusk that makes everything feel possible. My steps, without conscious thought, led me to his door. My heart pounded not with fear, but with a terrifying and exhilarating hope. I knocked. He opened the door, his expression softening as he saw me. He didn't rush me with questions. He simply stepped aside and let me in. We didn't fall into an embrace. We sat on his couch, a respectable distance between us, and we talked. We spoke of the difficult path ahead, of the scars we both carried, of the terrifying fragility of starting over. And then, when the words ran out, I leaned into him. Not for escape, not for rescue, but for connection. He wrapped his arms around me, and I let myself be held. It wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. I had not been saved by a man. I had finally, after a lifetime of holding my breath, saved myself. And he was there, not to complete me, but to meet me, to stand beside me as I learned to breathe again, ready to walk with me wherever I was brave enough to go.